So when Shane asked me to fill in for him today, he said, now you realize it's the Sunday after a very contentious election. It's Peace Sunday. It's Caregiving Sunday. It's Veterans Sunday. I'll see you when I get back. So trying to piece all of them, no pun intended, but trying to piece all that together, I can only say that what is about to come forth cannot possibly be all of my doing. So I'm just going to lay it out there for you. We're living in a time and culture of social displacement. And what I mean by that is that many people among us are not just lacking in sheltering structures, but in social realities and physical and emotional realities and cognitive realities and spiritual realities. There are many among us and there are many far away from us who are trying to find their footing in the world and trying to find their place. And there's a loss of social and cultural identity. I teach people who, for the most part, haven't a clue yet what their identity is going to be. We spent a whole week talking about all the different identities that they would need to eventually resolve. That would be everything from their own personal identity to their gender identity, their sexual identity, their religious identity, their political identity, their relational identity, their spiritual identity. There's a loss of social and cultural identity. There's a new state of being without an effective way of orientation in a very complex and confusing world. And in this culture of displacement, we live in the age of modern warfare, of imperialism, the refugee, the displaced person, mass immigration, people who are uprooted consistently from their native place and uprooted from their social norms. Life just doesn't work the way it used to. Have you ever felt that way? Life doesn't work the way it used to. It certainly doesn't feel the way it used to. So culture has become this ever-flowing, moving stream of interaction between beliefs and practices of diverse peoples. It is shaped and reshaped, it's made and remade, and here we are in the middle of it, just trying to do life. And yet we find ourselves being made and remade and shaped and reshaped by the embedded stories and languages and rituals and conventional norms of this ever-changing world and this ever-changing culture, and it leaves some of us just totally disoriented. Some of us maybe even more so than others, and we all are trying to find our footing, right? To find our place. And Jesus said, if you haven't done these things to the least of these, you haven't done them to me. He also said, if you have done these things to the least of these, you have done them for me. Now, in my work for 13 years as a congregational pastor and 12 years in education and counseling, I've witnessed people find a renewed sense of orientation in a world that is so incredibly disoriented. And a big part of that happening is because believers like you and churches like ours try very hard to practice what has become kind of known now in the parlance of church growth as radical hospitality. So therefore, two questions this morning. What is radical hospitality? One. Two, what does it have to do with the gospel? Now see, when we think of hospitality, well, we kind of discover that hospitality has lost its moral edge, has lost its moral meaning. When we say the word hospitality, it's maybe a way of describing our favorite hotel, or maybe it conjures up feelings of coziness and pleasant conversation with tea parties and crumpets. maybe cups of coffee with people we normally like, or at least people we don't mind being with, or at least people who fit our social category. But what if there's a different way of imagining hospitality? Stop and think for a minute what hospitality meant to the people of the ancient Near East. For a person from a nomadic desert culture traveling from nomad settlement to nomad settlement, a question of hospitality might very well mean the difference between life and death. It was usually the custom to allow a passing stranger to spend the night in your town or settlement, but then the expectation was that the person would move on. However, permission to camp overnight was by no means guaranteed. It was the normal social custom to view strangers with suspicion and as a potential threat to the community. I wonder if that sounds familiar. But remember the passage that Judy read us from Genesis. The reader is told that God himself appeared as not one stranger, but three strangers. And that God's encouragement is to provide strangers with food and clothing. And later on we read that you need to do that because you might be entertaining angels unaware. And Jesus said, if you don't do this to the least of these, then you haven't done it for me. But if you do this to the least of these, you have done it for me. In his book, 5 Practices of Fruitful Congregations, Robert Schnase defines radical hospitality like this: an active desire to invite, welcome, receive, and care for those who are strangers so that they find a spiritual home and discover for themselves the unending richness of a life in Christ. So hospitality isn't just about smiling at visitors who walk into the doors of our church. It's about an active desire to welcome and care for new people. New, unknown people. Now this is where the Greeks help us out, as they so often do. See, in the Greek language, the word philoxenia is the word that is translated into the English word hospitality. Philo meaning a kinship, brotherly type of associative love. Xenia meaning stranger. So when you put the two together, you get a love of strangers. So when you look at it in the language of the Greek, that's what you hear, is a love of strangers. The Greek concept of hospitality was one of practicing generosity and compassion shown to those who were strangers and who were actually maybe even just a little strange, to those who were specifically or felt like they were far from home, who were socially displaced. Now think caregiving, think peace. There's a whole different concept of hospitality. It was a concept of making room in their lives, in my life, in your life, to welcome others with courageous relational embrace. And if you were taking notes, if you were in my class, I would say, write this down. Courageous relational embrace. Where people, hang on, hold on. This is profound. I don't say many profound things. This is profound. Where people aren't viewed as problems to be solved or projects to be fixed, but rather people to be embraced. It's a whole different way of being in society. It's a whole different way, even in the midst of a society of violence and fear. And in this way of being that is hospitality, surprising friendships are made between guest and host because hospitality affirms our common humanity. But we live in a society of stranger danger, don't we? Of what we call xenophobia. We live in a society that tells us that strangers are to be feared, that they are viewed more as threats, and the problem is when fear becomes our basic posture for living. Now listen to me, folks. When fear becomes our basic posture for living, fear drives out any possibilities of generosity and compassion, because fear, hold on here, inevitably leads to self-protection. And self-protection leads to isolation. And isolation, folks, leads to more fear. And here we go. But when those surprising friendships are found, when a person is willing to open their life and open their space to make room in their lives with a courageous, relational embrace, then a common humanity becomes affirmed over and over and over again, because I no longer fear people. I no longer view people as problems to be fixed or projects to be solved, but persons to be embraced. So how does that tie in with the gospel? Totally. Because I think that there's a very real sense in which we can say that God invites us as strangers and sinners into His kingdom. And in order to fully benefit from His kingdom, we are invited to repent. God died in order to save us from the ravages of sin and death and the power of evil. So rather than having nothing to do with the message of the gospel, I think that radical hospitality has everything to do with the gospel. Because God gives us undeserved and unimaginable hospitality, and we are called as His children to give hospitality to others. God welcomes the sinner. God welcomes the stranger. God calls us also to welcome the sinner and the stranger in response to His welcome. It's a response. So I said earlier that the message of this sermon is radical hospitality. Why radical hospitality? Why not friendly hospitality? Why not common hospitality? Why not pleasant hospitality? Why not hospitable hospitality? And I hope we're beginning to see that the nature of true biblical hospitality is radical. It is extreme even. God's hospitality in welcoming us into His kingdom and offering salvation to us was costly. It wasn't easy. It wasn't nice. Sure wasn't friendly. Sure wasn't pleasant. And if we're going to communicate the height and the depth and the breadth of God's love to other people, we too will have to engage in some risky, costly hospitality. Stories told of a Lutheran pastor in the former East German province named Homer, H-O-L-M-E-R, Homer. Now, for those of you who remember the East German regime, know that to be a Christian in Eastern Germany was a risky business, let alone to be a Christian pastor. The regime discriminated against Christians, and one of its policies was to make it impossible for the children of Christian parents to attend university or any of the professions which required a university degree. Well, Pastor Homer and his wife had 10 children, all of whom were denied university places and who had to make a living through manual labor. Now, you may recognize some names. The person who was responsible for East Germany's educational policy for 26 years was Margot Honecker, the wife of East Germany's premier Erich Honecker. And then the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, and the East German regime was toppled, and Erich and Margot Honecker were seen by many people in East Germany as their enemies. They were indicted for criminal activities. They were evicted from their home. And the Honeckers suddenly found themselves friendless, homeless, without resources, with no place to go. No one wanted to have anything to do with the Honeckers. Nada. So it was at this point that Pastor Homer's family invited the Honeckers to live with them. Now, the fellow citizens were not terribly pleased with the Homer's hospitality. The pastor's family received hate mail. The children received death threats. Many members of his church left the congregation in protest. See, the hospitality offered by Pastor Homer was not just nice or even just noble. It was a radical hospitality. It was a risky hospitality. It was a dangerous hospitality that put him and his family at jeopardy at times. This is an example of truly radical hospitality. What on earth would cause a person to give shelter to people whose life's work and ideals had directly hurt their children's future? And what on earth could cause someone to continue to give shelter to them in the face of threats and abuse from friends, family, and fellow citizens? Nothing on earth could. Only the peace and love of God that passes all human understanding could cause someone to do that kind of thing. Are we capable of this kind of radical hospitality? I've got to be honest with you. Part of me hopes that I can behave that way in the same circumstances, and part of me hopes that I will never be tested in such a way. But yet I am inspired by Pastor Homer. His actions draw from me the highest form of respect and admiration. See, the good news of Jesus Christ, Paul tells us, is that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Or to look at it another way, God offered us radical hospitality when we were still strangers. In sending Jesus to die and rise again for our salvation, God was looking outside of himself for our needs. So here's the good news. I'll close with this. God does not ask you. God does not ask you. God does not ask me. God does not ask us to become holy before he invites us into his kingdom. He doesn't demand that we cease to be strangers and sinners before he offers us hospitality. Rather, he goes out into the highways and the byways and invites strangers and sinners into his kingdom, and then he invites us to repent so that we can grow in holiness. So the good news is that God is eternally looking outside of God's self to the welfare of others. And the good news is that God gives us an exciting purpose to our lives, to look outside of ourselves to the welfare of others. And we learn this as we practice the love of our neighbor. And who is our neighbor? You know who your neighbor is. My prayer is that the reality of God's hospitality this Thanksgiving season as we approach it and far beyond will fill our hearts anew this morning. And I also pray that filled with joy at the salvation we have been given and filled with thanksgiving and God's hospitality, that we will go from this place this morning determined to spread Christian hospitality, radical hospitality, to everyone we meet. And we will do that. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.